I'm Kate, and when I walked into my sister Jessica's wedding reception 6 years after she stole my inheritance while I was deployed in Afghanistan, I never expected the entire room to fall silent when they discovered who I'd become. The woman they all pitied as the broken soldier who lost everything was about to shock them in ways they never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas heat was suffocating as I pulled my rental car into the circular driveway of Willowbrook Estate, the same luxury venue where Riverside's elite held their most important celebrations. 6 years had passed since I'd last set foot in my hometown. 6 years since I'd discovered my sister's betrayal while I was serving my country halfway around the world. The elegant stone building rose before me like a monument to everything I'd been excluded from, its sprawling gardens and fountain. Speaking of the kind of wealth my family had always aspired to but never quite achieved, I adjusted the rearview mirror to check my reflection one final time. The emerald green dress I'd chosen was understated but elegant, crafted from the finest silk and tailored to perfection by a designer whose name would mean nothing to my family, but whose clientele included Fortune 500 executives and celebrity clients. The pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother caught the afternoon light, the only piece of family jewelry I'd managed to keep when everything else had been stripped away from me during my deployment. My phone buzzed with a text from my business partner Rachel back in Austin. "Remember, you don't owe them anything. You built this empire yourself. Walk in there like the queen you are." I smiled despite my nerves. Rachel was right. The woman entering this wedding reception today was nothing like the naive 22-year-old who had enlisted in the Army 6 years ago, leaving behind what she thought was a secure inheritance and a sister she trusted with her life. The parking area was filled with luxury vehicles, Mercedes sedans, and BMW SUVs that belonged to Riverside social climbing families. I recognized several cars from my youth, vehicles owned by people who had once looked down on our middle-class family but who now eagerly attended Jessica's wedding to the son of the town's most prominent real estate developer. My own vehicle, a modest rental sedan, looked out of place among the ostentatious displays of wealth, which was exactly how I preferred it. Let them continue to underestimate me for a little longer. As I approached the entrance, memories flooded back of the last time I'd been home. It was 3 days before my deployment, and I was saying goodbye to everyone I loved, believing I was leaving my future secure in the hands of the sister who had always been my closest confidant. Our grandparents had left us their 200-acre ranch outside town, a property that had been in our family for 3 generations. Jessica and I had always planned to work it together when I returned from the military, maybe turn it into something special, a wedding venue or retreat center. I had signed power of attorney papers before leaving, standard procedure for deployed soldiers, giving Jessica the legal authority to handle my affairs while I was overseas. It seemed logical since she was studying business administration and had always been better with paperwork and legal matters. What I never imagined was that she would use those papers to sell our grandfather's ranch without my knowledge or consent, pocketing the entire proceeds while I was dodging mortar rounds in Afghanistan. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound I'd sustained in combat. I discovered it through a casual comment in an email from our cousin Emma, who mentioned how sorry she was that we'd had to sell Grandpa's place. When I confronted Jessica via video call, she'd broken down in tears, claiming she'd been forced to sell because of property taxes and maintenance costs I couldn't afford to pay while deployed. She promised to split the money with me when I returned, but by the time I made it home, every penny had vanished into what she claimed were investment losses and emergency expenses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My family had rallied around Jessica's version of events, painting me as the ungrateful sister who couldn't understand the sacrifices she'd made to protect my interests while I was away. They chose to believe her tearful explanations rather than investigate the timeline of events that showed the sale had occurred just weeks after my departure, when no property taxes were even due. The family I'd served to protect had abandoned me when I needed them most, leaving me to rebuild my life from nothing at age 28. The young woman checking invitations at the entrance looked up with a professional smile as I approached. "Good afternoon. Welcome to the Williams Parker wedding. Name, please?" "Kate Williams," I replied, straightening my shoulders and meeting her gaze directly. "I'm the bride's sister." Her eyes widened slightly as she searched her tablet, clearly not expecting this response. Jessica had probably seated me as far from the family as possible, if she'd included me on the guest list at all. After a moment of scrolling, she found my name with a look of relief. "Of course, Miss Williams. You're at table 12. She handed me a small card with the table number. "The cocktail hour is in the garden area to your right. Dinner will be served at 7. I thanked her and made my way toward the sound of conversation and clinking glasses, my heels clicking against the polished stone pathway. The garden area was magnificent, with towering oak trees draped in twinkling lights and elegant floral arrangements that must have cost more than most people's monthly salary. Round tables covered in cream linens were scattered throughout the space, each one surrounded by the kind of people who defined Riverside's social hierarchy. I spotted my mother immediately, her silver hair perfectly styled and her navy dress probably purchased specifically for this occasion. She stood near the bar with my father and my Aunt Susan, their conversation animated as they gestured toward the elaborate decorations. None of them had seen me yet, which gave me a moment to steel myself for the inevitable awkwardness of our reunion. My father looked older than his 62 years, his hairline having receded significantly since I'd last seen him. He wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to my high school graduation, and probably every important family event since then. My mother had gained weight, her face rounder but still carrying the same expression of perpetual worry that had defined most of my childhood. 6 years of minimal contact had reduced our relationship to obligatory birthday cards and brief holiday phone calls. They'd made their choice when they sided with Jessica's version of events, and I'd made mine when I decided to build my future without depending on their support or understanding. The Christmas cards I'd sent from Austin over the years had been polite but distant, sharing just enough information to let them know I was alive and well, but nothing about the business empire I'd been quietly constructing. I approached the bar and ordered a sparkling water with lime, not trusting myself with alcohol when I needed to keep my wits about me. The bartender, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, handed me my drink with a smile that suggested he didn't recognize me as anyone significant. Perfect. Kate Williams? The voice belonged to Emma, my cousin who was 2 years younger than me, and had always been the family gossip. She approached with wide eyes and an expression of genuine surprise. "I can't believe you're here. Mom said she wasn't sure if you'd make it." "I wouldn't miss Jessica's big day," I replied, keeping my tone neutral and pleasant. Emma looked exactly as I remembered her, petite and energetic, with blonde hair that was probably enhanced but looked natural enough to pass casual inspection. "You look amazing," she continued, her gaze taking in my dress and accessories. "Military life must agree with you. Are you still stationed somewhere?" The assumption that I was still active duty military was exactly what I'd expected. My family had never bothered to keep track of my actual career progression, content to maintain their mental image of me as a struggling veteran trying to find her place in civilian life. "I finished my service 3 years ago," I said simply. "I've been living in Austin since then." "Austin? How exciting! What are you doing there?" Emma's question seemed genuine, unlike the obligatory inquiries I expected from other family members. "I work in real estate development," I replied, which was technically true even if it drastically understated the scope of my business operations. "It's been keeping me busy." Before Emma could ask follow-up questions, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Jessica had arrived with her bridal party. A vision in white silk and lace that probably cost more than I'd earned in my entire first year out of the military. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate updo decorated with pearl pins, and her makeup was flawless in the way that only professional artists could achieve. She moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting congratulations and air kisses from the assembled guests while her photographer captured every moment. David, her groom, followed behind her, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention but clearly proud to be marrying into what everyone believed was Riverside's newest power couple. I watched from a distance as Jessica made her rounds, noting how she carefully positioned herself to be photographed with the most prominent families in attendance. This was clearly more than just a wedding for her. It was a social elevation ceremony designed to cement her place among the local elite. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was funding this elaborate display with money that had rightfully belonged to both of us. "She looks beautiful, doesn't she?" Emma said beside me, following my gaze toward Jessica. David's family spared no expense for this wedding. I heard they spent over $100,000. $100,000. The figure struck me like a physical blow, not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented. Jessica was casually spending on a single day what would have taken our grandfather decades to save from his ranch operations. Money that had been built through generations of hard work and sacrifice, now being frittered away on flowers and photographers and imported champagne. "It's certainly impressive," I managed to say, taking a sip of my sparkling water to buy myself a moment to process the emotions threatening to surface. My phone vibrated discreetly in my clutch, and I glanced at it to see a message from Marcus, my former army buddy who now worked as head of security for my commercial properties. "Hope you're surviving the family drama. Remember, you have 3 buildings in downtown Austin that generate more monthly revenue than most of these people make in a year." Marcus was one of the few people who knew the full extent of what I'd built since leaving the military. He'd been there during my darkest moments after discovering Jessica's betrayal, and he'd celebrated with me when my first property investment had paid off beyond my wildest expectations. His reminder helped me regain my composure and remember why I was really here. The truth was, I hadn't come to this wedding seeking reconciliation or family bonding. I'd come because 6 years of silence had given me something more valuable than revenge. It had given me success beyond anything my family could imagine. Let them continue to see me as the struggling veteran's sister, while I quietly owned half the commercial real estate in one of Texas's fastest-growing cities. "Excuse me, are you Kate Williams?" A woman approached our small group, her expression curious and slightly uncertain. She was elegantly dressed in a burgundy cocktail dress, probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent brown eyes. "Yes, I am," I replied, wondering how this stranger knew my name. "I'm Margaret Davidson, David's mother," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Jessica has told us so much about her sister, the veteran. Thank you for your service." I shook her hand, noting the genuine warmth in her greeting compared to the polite distance I'd grown accustomed to from my own family. "Thank you, Mrs. Davidson. This is a beautiful celebration. Please call me Margaret. And I have to say, I'm so impressed by what Jessica's told us about your business ventures in Austin. Real estate development is such a challenging field, especially for someone starting from scratch." My eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected comment. Jessica had been talking about my business? This was news to me, since we'd barely spoken in the past 6 years beyond the most basic pleasantries. "She mentioned that you've been quite successful with commercial properties," Margaret continued. "David's been looking for investment opportunities outside of Riverside, and I told him he should speak with you about the Austin market." Emma was staring at me with open confusion, clearly having no idea what Margaret was talking about. My own family knew nothing about my business success, but somehow Jessica had been sharing information with her future in-laws. The revelation was both puzzling and slightly unsettling. "That's very kind of her to mention," I said carefully, unsure how much Jessica actually knew about my operations, or what she might have told the Davidson family. "Well, I hope we'll have a chance to chat more during the reception," Margaret said warmly. "I understand you'll be seated with some of David's business associates. They've been looking forward to meeting you." She moved away to greet other guests, leaving me standing with Emma, who was practically vibrating with curiosity. "Kate, what was she talking about?" Emma whispered urgently. "Since when are you some big real estate developer, and why would Jessica know about it when the rest of us don't?" Before I could formulate an answer, a bell chimed softly across the garden, signaling guests to find their seats for dinner. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, giving me an excuse to avoid Emma's increasingly probing questions. "I should find my table," I said, extracting myself from the conversation with practiced grace. "We'll catch up more later." Table 12 was located toward the back of the dining area, partially hidden behind an ornate floral arrangement that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. As I approached, I could see that my dining companions were indeed David's business associates, a group of well-dressed professionals who looked like they'd be more comfortable in a corporate boardroom than at a wedding reception. "You must be Kate," said a distinguished man in his early 50s as I reached the table. He stood to pull out my chair, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that surprised me. "I'm Robert Chen. I work with David's father in commercial development." Margaret Davidson told us we might have some business interests in common. As I settled into my seat, the other occupants of the table introduced themselves. There was Linda Rodriguez, a property management specialist, James Parker, a real estate attorney, and Sarah Mitchell, who worked in investment banking. These were serious professionals, not the social climbers and family friends I'd expected to find at the back table. "So you're working in Austin real estate?" Linda asked as servers began bringing out the first course, a delicate salad with local greens and goat cheese. "That's an exciting market right now. The growth has been incredible." "Yes, it's been keeping me busy," I replied, still uncertain how much to reveal about my actual operations. "What type of properties are you focusing on?" James inquired with professional interest. "Residential, commercial, mixed use?" The conversation felt natural and engaging in a way that family interactions rarely did for me. These people were asking about my work because they found it genuinely interesting, not because they were looking for gossip or reasons to judge my life choices. "Primarily commercial," I said, beginning to relax slightly. "Office buildings, retail spaces, some mixed-use developments in emerging neighborhoods." "Smart focus," Robert nodded approvingly. "The commercial sector in Austin has been outperforming most other markets. Are you working with local investors or bringing in outside capital?" For the next 20 minutes, as we worked our way through the beautifully prepared meal, our conversation flowed easily between market analysis, investment strategies, and development challenges. I found myself sharing insights and experiences I'd gained over the past 3 years, carefully, avoiding specific details about the scale of my operations, but revealing enough expertise to demonstrate my credibility. "You know," Sarah said as servers cleared our salad plates, "you should consider joining the Texas Commercial Real Estate Association. We have quarterly meetings in both Austin and Dallas, and the networking opportunities are excellent." "I'll look into that," I replied, though I was already a member of several professional organizations that these well-meaning people probably hadn't heard of. During a brief lull in conversation, I became aware of attention from nearby tables. My mother was seated 3 tables away with extended family, and I could see her glancing in my direction with an expression of confusion. She was probably wondering why I was engaged in such animated conversation with David's business associates, instead of sitting quietly with distant relatives or family friends. The main course arrived, perfectly prepared filet mignon with seasonal vegetables that demonstrated the level of catering Jessica and David had invested in for their celebration. As we ate, the conversation at our table continued to center on real estate and business development, with my dinner companions treating me as a peer rather than an outsider or curiosity. "Kate," Linda said as she set down her fork, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you get started in commercial real estate? It's not an easy field to break into, especially without family connections or significant startup capital." The question cut to the heart of my story, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with remembering those early days after my discharge from the military. How could I explain that I'd started with nothing because my inheritance had been stolen, that I'd built everything through a combination of veteran loans, strategic partnerships, and relentless determination to prove I didn't need anyone's help? "I started small," I said finally, used a VA loan to purchase a small office building that needed renovation, then reinvested the profits into larger properties. It's been a gradual process. Robert leaned forward with interest. "That's impressive. Most people don't have the patience for that kind of long-term wealth building. What was your first property?" "A 4-unit office building in East Austin," I replied, remembering the rundown structure that had become the foundation of everything I'd built since. Nothing glamorous, but it had good bones and was in a neighborhood I believed would appreciate. "East Austin has exploded in the past 5 years, James observed. "If you got in early, you must have seen incredible returns." The understatement almost made me smile. That first building, purchased for $400,000 with a VA loan, was now worth over $2 million, and generated enough monthly rental income to cover the mortgage payments on 3 additional properties. But I wasn't ready to share those kinds of details with strangers, no matter how professionally minded they seemed. As dinner concluded and servers began clearing the main course plates, I noticed increased activity at the head table, where Jessica and David sat with their families. Jessica kept glancing in my direction, her expression difficult to read from this distance. Had Margaret Davidson mentioned our conversation to her? Was she wondering what I was discussing with David's business associates? The evening was progressing exactly as I'd anticipated, with one notable exception. I had expected to be marginalized and ignored, relegated to awkward small talk with distant relatives who remembered me as the family disappointment. Instead, I found myself engaged in the kind of professional networking conversation that was more valuable than anything I'd experienced at formal business events. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ's voice interrupted the dinner conversation as he began introducing the evening's speakers. "Please welcome the father of the bride, Robert Williams." My father stood at the head table, his face slightly flushed from wine and the attention of 200 guests. He cleared his throat nervously and began the traditional father of the bride speech, sharing memories of Jessica's childhood and expressing his pride in the woman she'd become. "Jessica has always been our social butterfly," he said with obvious affection, "the one who could make friends with anyone and turn every gathering into a celebration. She's found her perfect match in David, and Linda and I couldn't be happier to welcome him into our family." I listened to his words with mixed emotions, remembering how different his tone had been when discussing my own life choices. When I'd announced my decision to enlist in the Army, he'd questioned my judgment and worried about my future. When I'd moved to Austin after my discharge, he'd expressed doubts about my ability to succeed in a competitive city without family support. Yet here he was, glowing with pride as he celebrated Jessica's achievements. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's greatest achievement, in my father's eyes, was marrying into a successful family using money she'd obtained by betraying her own sister. But I kept these thoughts to myself, maintaining the pleasant expression I'd perfected for family gatherings. "To Jessica and David," my father concluded, raising his champagne glass. "May your love grow stronger with each passing year." The toast was echoed throughout the room as guests raised their glasses in celebration. I participated with the same polite enthusiasm as everyone else, though my sparkling water felt inadequate compared to the champagne flowing at every other table. As my father returned to his seat, the DJ began organizing guests for the traditional family photos. I watched from my table as immediate family members were called forward, noting that no one beckoned for me to join them. This exclusion was expected and probably preferred by everyone involved, but it still stung in a way that surprised me after 6 years of emotional distance from my family. "Family dynamics are complicated, aren't they?" Robert Chen observed quietly, having noticed my reaction to being excluded from the photo session. "Indeed they are," I replied, grateful that he didn't press for details or offer unwanted sympathy. As the photography session continued, I excused myself from the table and stepped outside onto a stone terrace that overlooked the estate's vineyards. The evening air was cooler than the indoor reception area, and the quiet offered a welcome respite from the constant noise and activity inside. My phone buzzed with another message from Rachel. "How's it going? Remember, you're the one with the business empire." They're still stuck in the same small town, with the same small minds. Rachel was right, of course. I'd built something extraordinary from nothing, transforming the devastating betrayal that could have destroyed me into motivation for unprecedented success. My properties in Austin were generating more monthly income than most of these wedding guests earned in a year, and I was building toward a level of financial independence that would have seemed impossible 6 years ago. But standing alone on this terrace while my family celebrated inside without me, I was reminded that success couldn't completely heal certain wounds. The money and properties and professional recognition were satisfying, but they couldn't restore the relationships that had been broken, or replace the family support I'd lost when I needed it most. "Kate?" Jessica's voice came from behind me, and I turned to see my sister approaching with careful steps in her elaborate wedding dress. Her makeup was still perfect, but I could see tension around her eyes that suggested the day was taking its toll. "Jessica," I replied evenly. "Beautiful ceremony. You look stunning." "Thank you," she said, reaching the stone railing where I stood. For a moment we looked out over the vineyard together without speaking. Two sisters who had once been inseparable now struggling to find common ground. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally. "I said I would." I know, but things have been— She paused, searching for the right words. Complicated between us. Complicated. Such a gentle word for betrayal, theft, and family destruction. But this was neither the time nor the place for that conversation, and we both knew it. Your new in-laws seem lovely, I said instead. Margaret Davidson was telling me about David's business interests. Jessica's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been anxiety. Yes, the Davidsons have been very welcoming. They're interested in expanding their real estate investments. So I gathered. Apparently you've mentioned my work in Austin to them? Now Jessica looked genuinely uncomfortable, her gaze shifting away from mine toward the vineyard. I may have mentioned that you were doing well. How would you know how I'm doing, Jessica? We haven't had a real conversation in years. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers nervously adjusting the pearl bracelet that matched her earrings. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than usual. I've been keeping track, she admitted. Emma follows your social media, and she mentions things sometimes. And I may have done some research. Research. The word hung between us, like an admission of guilt. What kind of research had she done? And why? Before I could ask follow-up questions, David appeared on the terrace looking for his bride. There you are, he said with obvious relief. Your mother's looking for you. Something about the cake-cutting ceremony. Jessica straightened immediately, transforming back into the radiant bride who belonged at the center of attention. Of course. Kate, we should go back inside. As we walked back toward the reception, I found myself wondering exactly what Jessica had discovered through her research, and why she'd been motivated to look into my life at all. Did she feel guilty about what she'd done? Was she worried about potential consequences? Or was she simply curious about whether I'd ever recovered from the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me? The cake-cutting ceremony proceeded with all the traditional pomp and photography, followed by the first dance and parent dances that brought tears to many eyes. Throughout these festivities, I remained at my assigned table with David's business associates, who continued to include me in their conversations about real estate markets and investment opportunities. It was during the open dancing portion of the evening that everything changed. The dance floor filled with couples swaying to romantic ballads while I remained seated at table 12, nursing my second sparkling water and watching the celebration unfold. The business associates had gradually dispersed to mingle with other guests, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing awareness that I was once again the outsider looking in. My Aunt Susan approached my table with the determined stride of someone on a mission. She wore a floral print dress that was probably expensive but managed to look dated anyway, her silver hair teased into a style that hadn't changed since the 1980s. Behind her followed my Uncle Tom, looking uncomfortable in his suit and clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Kate, honey, Aunt Susan said with an overly bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. We've barely had a chance to talk. Come sit with us for a minute. She didn't wait for my response before settling into the chair beside me, while Uncle Tom took the seat across from us with a heavy sigh. I could see other family members watching our interaction from various tables, clearly curious about what conversation was about to unfold. You look well, Aunt Susan continued, her eyes scanning my dress and jewelry with the practiced assessment of someone who prided herself on reading people's financial status through their appearance. That's a lovely dress, very sophisticated. Thank you, I replied, recognizing the tone that preceded uncomfortable questions about my personal life. We were just saying to your mother how surprised we are that you made it tonight. Military life must keep you so busy. She paused meaningfully. Though I suppose you have more free time now that you're out. Uncle Tom shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with his wife's probing approach. He'd always been the gentler of the two, preferring to avoid family drama whenever possible. I've been keeping busy, I said simply, offering no additional details about my current situation. Oh, I'm sure you have, Aunt Susan said with a knowing nod. It must be difficult adjusting to civilian life. So many veterans struggle with that transition. Finding steady work, managing finances, dealing with all those challenges. Her words were carefully chosen to sound sympathetic while actually being condescending. She was fishing for information about my supposed struggles, probably hoping to gather gossip material for future family discussions. The transition has gone better than expected, I replied, maintaining my polite tone despite the irritation building inside me. Well, that's wonderful to hear, she said, though her expression suggested she didn't quite believe me. And you're living in Austin now? Such an expensive city. I hope you're managing okay with rent and everything. Uncle Tom cleared his throat softly, a warning that his wife was pushing too hard. But Aunt Susan was nothing if not persistent when she sensed a story worth pursuing. Actually, I'm doing quite well, I said, deciding to give her a small hint of the truth. I own my place in Austin. Her eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected information. Oh, how nice. A little apartment or condo? Something like that, I replied vaguely, not mentioning that my something like that was a 3-bedroom penthouse in one of Austin's most desirable buildings. Before Aunt Susan could ask more probing questions, my mother appeared at our table looking flustered and slightly overwhelmed by the evening's events. Kate, there you are, she said, as if I'd been hiding rather than sitting exactly where I'd been placed. I've been meaning to come talk to you all evening. She took the empty chair next to Uncle Tom, her movements careful in the navy dress she'd clearly purchased specifically for this occasion. My mother had always been particular about dressing appropriately for important family events, and tonight was no exception. The wedding is beautiful, I said, offering her an easy conversational opening. Yes, Jessica has done such a lovely job with everything, my mother agreed, her pride evident in every word. The Davidsons have been so generous with their support. This venue alone must have cost a fortune. The irony of her comment wasn't lost on me. Jessica was able to afford her contribution to this expensive celebration because she'd stolen money that belonged to both of us. But my mother either didn't remember or chose not to acknowledge that inconvenient detail. Margaret Davidson seems like a lovely woman, I said diplomatically. Oh, she is, my mother said enthusiastically, so cultured and well-traveled. She's been telling me about their vacation home in Napa Valley and their art collection. The family has such refined tastes. I noticed how my mother's voice carried a tone of aspiration, as if she hoped some of the Davidsons' sophistication might rub off on our family through Jessica's marriage. It was the same tone she'd used when discussing the wealthy families in Riverside during my childhood, always slightly envious but trying to sound casual about their advantages. She mentioned that you've been successful with some business ventures, my mother continued, her expression curious. I had no idea you were involved in anything like that. Aunt Susan leaned forward eagerly, clearly hoping for more specific information about my mysterious business activities. I've had some good opportunities, I said carefully, unwilling to provide details that would inevitably be misunderstood or misrepresented in future family conversations. What kind of opportunities? My mother pressed. Are you working for a company or doing something on your own? The question revealed how little my family understood about my life since leaving Riverside. They still saw me as the young woman who had enlisted in the Army 6 years ago, not considering how much I might have changed or accomplished in the intervening years. I work independently, I replied. Real estate development and investment. Uncle Tom's eyebrows rose at this information. He'd worked in construction for most of his career and had some understanding of the real estate industry. That's a tough business, he said with genuine interest, especially starting out on your own. Takes significant capital to get into development work. His observation was accurate and created an uncomfortable silence at our table. Where would a discharged veteran, with no family support, get the kind of money needed for real estate development? The question hung in the air, unasked but clearly on everyone's mind. I started small and reinvested profits, I explained, which was true even if it didn't tell the complete story of the veteran loans, strategic partnerships, and 18-hour workdays that had made my success possible. How small? Aunt Susan asked with the persistence of a prosecutor. Susan, Uncle Tom warned quietly, recognizing that his wife was being inappropriately intrusive. I'm just curious, she protested. It's wonderful that Kate has found something she enjoys. I'm sure we'd all love to hear more about her success. My mother nodded agreement, though I could see concern in her eyes. She'd always worried about my tendency to take risks and make unconventional choices. and the idea of me involved in real estate development probably triggered all her maternal anxieties. Maybe we could talk more about it later, I suggested, hoping to deflect the increasingly uncomfortable interrogation. Of course, dear, my mother said, though I could tell she was disappointed not to get immediate answers to her questions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma, who appeared at our table with a champagne flute in her hand and a slightly unfocused expression that suggested she'd been sampling the open bar liberally. "Family meeting?" she asked cheerfully, pulling up an empty chair from a nearby table. "Mind if I join?" Without waiting for permission, she settled between my mother and Aunt Susan, creating an even tighter circle around me. I was beginning to feel like a defendant facing a tribunal rather than a guest at a family wedding. "We were just hearing about Kate's business adventures," Aunt Susan informed Emma with obvious satisfaction at having an additional audience. "Oh yes, the mysterious real estate empire," Emma said with a giggle that suggested she found the entire concept amusing. "Kate, you have to tell us more. Are you flipping houses or something?" The dismissive tone in her voice rankled more than I cared to admit. Emma had always been quick to minimize other people's achievements, particularly if they threatened her position as the family's designated success story through her marriage to a local dentist. "It's more complicated than house flipping," I said evenly. "Everything's more complicated when Kate explains it," Emma said with another laugh. "Remember when we were kids and she'd turn simple games into elaborate strategies with rules and theories?" The comment was meant to be affectionate nostalgia, but it carried an undertone of dismissal that suggested my current business activities were just another example of my tendency to overcomplicate simple things. My father appeared at our impromptu family gathering, carrying a tumbler of what was certainly his preferred whiskey, and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What's everyone discussing so seriously?" he asked, settling into another commandeered chair. "Kate's business ventures," my mother replied quickly. "She's been telling us about her real estate work in Austin." My father's expression became carefully neutral, the same look he'd worn whenever my career choices came up in conversation. He'd never quite understood my decision to leave Riverside or my ambitions beyond traditional family expectations. "Real estate can be profitable if you know what you're doing," he said diplomatically. "Risky business, though. Easy to lose money if you make the wrong decisions." His comment was typical of his approach to my life choices, acknowledgement wrapped in warnings and doubt. Even when trying to be supportive, he couldn't resist emphasizing the potential for failure. "Kate seems to be doing well," Uncle Tom interjected, possibly trying to provide some balance to the conversation. "I'm sure she is," my father agreed, though his tone suggested polite skepticism rather than genuine belief. Emma leaned forward conspiratorially. "So Kate, are you making enough money to afford that fancy penthouse lifestyle? Austin's gotten so expensive lately." Her question revealed that she'd been doing research of her own, probably through social media stalking or conversations with mutual acquaintances. The mention of a penthouse was particularly telling, since I'd never shared details about my living situation with any family members. "I'm comfortable," I replied carefully, wondering what other information Emma had gathered and how much she'd shared with the rest of the family. "Comfortable enough to attend events like this," Aunt Susan observed, gesturing toward the elegant wedding reception surrounding us. "This kind of celebration isn't cheap." Her implication was clear but unstated. If I could afford to attend an expensive wedding, buy an appropriate dress, and travel from Austin, perhaps my financial situation was better than they'd assumed. "Jessica's wedding is important," I said simply. "I wanted to be here for her." "Of course you did," my mother said warmly, though I caught her exchanging a meaningful glance with Aunt Susan. "Family comes first." The irony of her statement was almost overwhelming. Family came first, except when Jessica had sold our inherited property without my knowledge or consent. Family came first, except when everyone had chosen to believe her explanations rather than investigate the truth. Family came first, except when I'd been left to rebuild my life completely alone. "Has Jessica mentioned anything about her future plans?" I asked, changing the subject away from my own circumstances. "Oh, she and David have such exciting ideas," my mother said eagerly. "They're planning to expand David's father's business into new markets." Jessica will be handling the marketing and client relations. Sounds ambitious, I replied, though I wondered how much of their expansion plans were funded by money that should have been split between Jessica and me. The Davidson family has such good business sense, Aunt Susan added. They've built their company from nothing into one of the most successful real estate firms in this part of Texas. Uncle Tom nodded agreement. Good reputation in the construction industry. They pay their contractors on time and don't cut corners on quality. Their praise for the Davidson family's business acumen created an uncomfortable contrast with their skeptical attitude toward my own professional activities. The Davidsons were successful and therefore worthy of respect, while my achievements remained suspect until proven otherwise. Maybe you could learn something from their approach, my father suggested. Established businesses with proven track records are usually safer than trying to build something from scratch. His advice carried the implication that my independent approach was unnecessarily risky compared to the security of joining an existing organization. It was the same perspective that had led him to question my military service and my decision to move to Austin rather than staying in Riverside, where family connections might have provided stability. Different approaches work for different people, I said diplomatically, though I was growing tired of defending choices that had proven successful beyond anything my family could imagine. Emma's phone buzzed with a notification, and she glanced at it with the automatic reflex of someone accustomed to constant digital communication. "Oh my God," she said suddenly, her expression shifting from casual interest to shock. "Kate, is this your building?" She held up her phone, showing what appeared to be a news article or social media post. From my angle, I could see a photograph of a modern office building that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't read the accompanying text. "What building?" I asked, though a sinking feeling in my stomach suggested I knew where this was heading. "The Meridian Tower in downtown Austin," Emma read from her phone. "Says here it just sold for $45 million to a private investment group. One of the fastest-growing commercial properties in the city." The silence at our table was immediate and complete. Everyone stared at Emma's phone as if it contained information that couldn't possibly be accurate. "Why would you think that has anything to do with Kate?" my mother asked carefully. Emma's eyes were wide as she continued reading. "Because the article mentions that the building was developed and previously owned by Williams Development Group. How many Williams families can there be in Austin real estate?" My father reached for Emma's phone to read the article himself, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion as he processed the information on the screen. "Williams Development Group," he read aloud slowly. "Founded 3 years ago by Catherine Williams, a former Army veteran who has become one of Austin's most successful commercial property developers." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Catherine Williams, former Army veteran, founded 3 years ago. The timeline and details matched my background perfectly, but the scale of success described in the article was far beyond what anyone at this table had imagined possible. $45 million, Aunt Susan whispered, as if saying the number too loudly might make it disappear. Uncle Tom was staring at me with an expression of dawning realization. "Kate, is this article about you?" Before I could formulate a response, my mother leaned over to read the article herself, her face growing pale as she absorbed the details. "It says Williams Development Group owns 12 commercial properties in Austin," she read in a voice barely above a whisper. "Combined value estimated at over $120 million. Emma set her phone down on the table with trembling hands. "Kate, are you telling us you're worth over $100 million? The question seemed to echo across our small circle, and I became aware that guests at nearby tables were beginning to notice our intense conversation. The celebration continued around us, but our family group had become a pocket of stunned silence in the middle of the festivities. "The article is about my company," I confirmed quietly, knowing there was no point in denying facts that were apparently available through simple internet searches. My father was still holding Emma's phone, scrolling through additional information with the methodical focus of someone trying to understand a completely unexpected development. "Catherine Williams, 34, began her real estate career with a single property purchase in East Austin," he read aloud. "Through strategic acquisitions and development projects, she has built one of the region's most successful commercial real estate portfolios. Aunt Susan was gripping her champagne glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. "Kate, honey, why didn't you tell us about any of this?" The question carried a note of hurt feelings that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so tense. Why hadn't I told them about my success? Perhaps because they'd chosen to believe Jessica's lies about my inheritance. Perhaps because they'd shown no interest in my life after leaving Riverside. Perhaps because every conversation with my family ended with skepticism about my choices and advice to pursue more conventional paths. "It's not something I talk about much," I said carefully. "Not something you talk about?" Emma repeated incredulously. "Kate, you're apparently one of the most successful business owners in Austin, and you've never mentioned it to your own family?" My mother was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. "All this time, we thought you were struggling to get by, and you've been building a business empire?" The word empire seemed excessive, but I understood their shock. From their perspective, I'd gone from discharged veteran to multimillionaire business owner, without any of them being aware of the transformation. "How is this possible?" my father asked, his tone suggesting he still wasn't entirely convinced the article was accurate. "Starting a real estate development company requires enormous capital. Where did you get the money to begin?" His question cut to the heart of the issue that none of them wanted to address directly. How had I acquired the resources for such ambitious business ventures when my inheritance had been stolen while I was serving overseas? "I started with a VA loan for my first property," I explained. "Reinvested profits, took on partners for larger projects, built relationships with investors who believed in my vision. But the scale of this," my mother gestured toward Emma's phone, "this is far beyond what you could build from a single VA loan." She was right. Of course, my success had required much more than government assistance and careful reinvestment. It had required the kind of intense focus and determination that came from having nothing left to lose, the motivation that came from betrayal so deep it had transformed pain into unstoppable ambition. Uncle Tom leaned back in his chair, studying me with new respect. "Kate, this is incredible. I had no idea you had this kind of business acumen." "None of us did," Aunt Susan added, her voice carrying a note of defensiveness, as if my success reflected poorly on their ability to recognize potential. Emma picked up her phone again, continuing to scroll through additional articles and information. "There's more here. Awards. Recognition from the Austin Chamber of Commerce. Mentions in business journals." Each new detail she shared seemed to deepen the shock around our table. I could see my family struggling to reconcile their image of me as the struggling veteran with the evidence of extraordinary professional success displayed on a smartphone screen. "The Austin Business Journal named you one of the top entrepreneurs under 40, Emma read, featured in Texas Monthly as a rising star in commercial real estate. Keynote speaker at the Texas Real Estate Investment Conference." My father set Emma's phone down and looked directly at me for the first time in years, not the polite, distant gaze of family obligation, but focused attention that suggested he was finally seeing me as more than his disappointing younger daughter. "Kate, I think we owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "For not understanding what you were building," he replied. "For not supporting your choices. For assuming you needed our advice instead of recognizing that you'd already found your own path to success." My mother reached across the table to touch my hand, a gesture of connection that surprised me with its warmth. "We're proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have said that years ago, but we're saying it now." The moment felt surreal, sitting at a wedding reception, while my family grappled with information that completely transformed their understanding of my life. Around us, the celebration continued, with dancing and laughter, while our small group processed revelations that changed everything. "Does Jessica know?" Aunt Susan asked suddenly. "About your success?" The question hung in the air with particular significance. If Jessica knew about my business empire, it would add new layers of complexity to our already strained relationship. Had she invited me to her wedding while knowing I was financially successful beyond her wildest dreams? Had she been living with the knowledge that the person she'd betrayed had ultimately thrived despite her actions? "I'm not sure what Jessica knows," I replied honestly. Emma was typing rapidly on her phone, presumably searching for more information or sharing the discovery with other family members. "This explains so much," she said without looking up. "No wonder Margaret Davidson was so interested in talking to you. David's family probably knows exactly who you are." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Of course, the Davidson family would have researched Jessica's background before welcoming her into their family. They would have discovered her sister's business success and probably viewed it as a positive family connection. Meanwhile, my own family had remained completely ignorant of achievements that were apparently well documented in business publications and online databases. "Kate," my mother said carefully, "if you've been this successful, why haven't you come home more often? Why have we barely heard from you in 6 years?" Her question contained multiple layers of hurt and confusion. From her perspective, my distance from the family seemed inexplicable given my apparent financial ability to visit whenever I wanted. How could I explain that success hadn't healed the wounds of betrayal? That financial independence couldn't restore trust that had been broken? That I'd built my empire partly as armor against ever being vulnerable to family manipulation again? "It's complicated," I said finally, knowing the answer was inadequate but unable to provide a more complete explanation in this public setting. Uncle Tom nodded slowly, perhaps understanding more than the others about the complex emotions involved in family relationships. "Well," he said quietly, "you're here now. That's what matters." But even as he spoke the words, I could see Jessica approaching our table with David in tow, her wedding dress rustling as she navigated between chairs and other guests. Her expression was impossible to read, but the timing of her arrival suggested she might have noticed our intense conversation from across the room. "What's everyone talking about so seriously?" Jessica asked with forced lightness as she reached our table. Emma held up her phone like evidence in a criminal trial. "We just discovered that Kate is apparently a real estate mogul." Jessica's face went completely white, confirming that she had indeed been aware of my business success. The color drained from her cheeks so completely that I worried she might faint in her elaborate wedding dress. "I can explain," she said quietly, though whether she was addressing me or the rest of the family wasn't clear. David looked confused by the sudden tension, his gaze moving between Jessica's pale face and our family's shocked expressions. "Explain what?" my father asked, his voice carrying a note of authority that suggested he expected complete honesty. Jessica glanced around the table, clearly calculating how much truth she could reveal without destroying her perfect wedding day. "I may have mentioned Kate's success to the Davidson family," she admitted reluctantly. "You mentioned it?" my mother repeated. "Jessica, how long have you known about Kate's business?" The question forced Jessica to choose between continued deception and honesty that might unravel everything she'd built. I watched her struggle with the decision, recognizing the same calculating expression she'd worn when explaining away my stolen inheritance 6 years earlier. But before she could answer, David's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message. He glanced at the screen and his expression immediately became serious. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately." The interruption couldn't have been more perfectly timed to postpone the confrontation that had been building at our table. Jessica looked relieved by the reprieve, quickly excusing herself to deal with whatever crisis required immediate attention. As they walked away together, I found myself surrounded by family members who were still processing the revelation of my success, while grappling with questions about Jessica's knowledge and motivations. The evening had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated, transforming from a simple family obligation into something far more complex and emotionally charged. The careful distance I'd maintained from my family for 6 years was crumbling under the weight of information that couldn't be ignored or explained away. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel back in Austin. "Hope you're surviving the family drama. Don't let them make you feel guilty for succeeding, despite their lack of support." Her message was perfectly timed, reminding me that I had allies and supporters beyond the complicated web of family relationships. But as I looked around the table at faces that showed mixtures of pride, confusion, and regret, I realized that the evening was far from over, and the most difficult conversations were yet to come. 20 minutes passed before Jessica and David returned to the reception, and when they did, their body language told a story of serious conversation and difficult decisions. Jessica's perfect composure had cracked slightly, her smile now forced and her movements less graceful than before. David walked beside her with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation that might require damage control. I had spent those 20 minutes fielding increasingly detailed questions from my family, who seemed unable to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Emma had found additional articles, business profiles, and even photographs from Austin Chamber of Commerce events, where I'd received recognition for my contributions to the local economy. Each new piece of information seemed to deepen their sense of having fundamentally misunderstood who I'd become. "Kate," my mother had said during Jessica's absence, "I keep thinking about all those Christmas cards you sent. You never mentioned any of this success. Why would you keep such wonderful news from your family?" The question revealed how little she understood about the emotional aftermath of Jessica's betrayal. How could I explain that sharing my achievements with people who had chosen to believe lies about my character felt like offering ammunition to those who had already wounded me? Success shared with family should be a source of joy and connection, but when trust has been broken, even good news becomes complicated. Now, watching Jessica approach our table with obvious reluctance, I could see that the evening was about to shift into even more difficult territory. She'd clearly been forced to reveal something to David during their private conversation, and whatever she'd told him had left both of them looking strained. "Sorry about that," Jessica said as she reached our table, her voice carrying a false brightness that fooled no one. "Just some vendor issues that needed immediate attention." David remained standing beside her, his expression polite but distant. Gone was the relaxed demeanor he'd displayed earlier in the evening, replaced by the careful neutrality of someone who had learned information that required careful handling. "Everything resolved?" my father asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the interruption had been about more than wedding logistics. "Yes, all taken care of," Jessica replied quickly, avoiding eye contact with me. Emma, who had continued researching during their absence, looked up from her phone with an expression of renewed shock. "Jessica, I found something else. Kate, did you know there's an entire article in Austin Business Weekly about how you started your company after returning from military deployment? It mentions that you had to rebuild completely from scratch because of family financial issues." The specificity of that detail made Jessica's face go even paler than before. Family financial issues was clearly a euphemistic way of describing the theft of my inheritance. And the fact that it had been reported in business publications meant the story was now part of the public record of my professional journey. "What kind of family financial issues?" Aunt Susan asked, with the tenacity of someone who sensed a significant story lurking beneath surface explanations. I could see Jessica struggling with how to respond. She couldn't deny the existence of the article that Emma was obviously reading from, but acknowledging the truth would expose her actions to our entire family in the most public possible setting. "There were some complications with our grandparents' estate," Jessica said carefully, choosing her words like someone navigating a minefield. "What kind of complications?" my father pressed, his tone carrying the authority of someone who expected complete honesty from his daughters. David shifted uncomfortably beside Jessica, clearly aware of details that cast his new wife in an unfavorable light. Whatever she'd told him during their private conversation had obviously included information about the inheritance situation. "The property taxes and maintenance costs were more than we anticipated," Jessica continued, sticking to her version of events from 6 years ago. "We had to make some difficult decisions while Kate was deployed." Uncle Tom, who had remained relatively quiet during most of our family discussion, suddenly leaned forward with interest. "Wait, are you talking about your grandfather's ranch? That beautiful spread out on Willow Creek Road?" Jessica nodded reluctantly, clearly wishing the conversation would move in any other direction. "But that property was worth significant money," Uncle Tom continued. "Even 6 years ago, land in that area was selling for premium prices. What happened to the proceeds from the sale?" His question cut directly to the heart of the matter that everyone had been dancing around. If Jessica had been forced to sell valuable property to cover expenses, where had the money gone? And why was I apparently starting my business career from scratch if I should have inherited half of a valuable ranch? "There were debts," Jessica said weakly. "More than we realized." Emma looked up from her phone again, her expression now openly skeptical. "This article says Kate started her business with a VA loan because she had no other capital available. If there were proceeds from selling family property, why wouldn't she have used that money instead of taking on debt?" The logical progression of Emma's question made it impossible for Jessica to maintain her story without directly lying to our entire family. I could see her calculating whether she could construct a believable explanation that would satisfy their growing suspicions. The situation was complicated, she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. My mother was watching this exchange with growing alarm, clearly sensing that there were aspects of the story she didn't understand. Jessica, what exactly happened with the ranch sale? Kate has never explained the details to us. The moment had arrived when Jessica would either have to confess the truth or construct increasingly elaborate lies to protect herself. I found myself almost feeling sorry for her as she stood in her beautiful wedding dress, surrounded by family members who were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about our relationship. David cleared his throat softly, drawing attention to himself. Maybe this isn't the best time or place for this discussion, he suggested diplomatically. But Emma was holding her phone up again, clearly having found additional information that she couldn't resist sharing. There's more in this article. It talks about how Kate's grandfather left the ranch property to both granddaughters equally, but Kate discovered the sale only after returning from deployment when she tried to visit the property. The silence that followed Emma's revelation was so complete that I could hear the string quartet playing on the other side of the reception area. Every person at our table was staring at Jessica, waiting for her to explain how her sister could have discovered the sale of jointly inherited property only after the fact. That's not exactly how it happened, Jessica said desperately, but her voice was barely audible. How did it happen? My father asked, his tone now carrying the edge of someone who suspected he'd been misled about important family matters. Jessica looked around the table like a trapped animal seeking escape routes. David remained beside her, but his expression suggested he was reconsidering his position as her ally in whatever version of events she'd previously shared with him. The timing was difficult, Jessica began, but Uncle Tom interrupted her. Jessica, honey, did you sell that ranch without Kate's knowledge or permission? The direct question hung in the air like an accusation. There was no way to answer it without either lying outright or admitting to actions that would be difficult to justify to people who valued family loyalty and honesty. I had power of attorney, Jessica said finally. I was legally authorized to make financial decisions while Kate was deployed. Power of attorney for emergencies, my mother said slowly, her understanding of the situation beginning to shift. Not for selling family property without consultation. Aunt Susan was gripping her champagne glass so tightly I could see the strain in her knuckles. Jessica, please tell me you didn't sell your sister's inheritance while she was serving our country overseas. The raw emotion in her voice reflected the horror that our family was beginning to feel as they grasped the true scope of what had happened. This wasn't just a financial disagreement or a misunderstanding about property management. This was betrayal of the deepest kind, committed against someone who was risking her life in military service. It wasn't like that, Jessica protested, but tears were starting to form in her eyes. I was trying to protect both of our interests. The property was becoming a financial burden. Where did the money go? Emma asked bluntly. If you sold a ranch worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect both your interests, where is Kate's half? Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, ruining the professional makeup that had been perfect throughout the wedding ceremony and reception. I invested it, she sobbed. I thought I could make it grow before Kate came home. I wanted to surprise her with more money than we would have had just from splitting the sale. What kind of investments? My father demanded, his voice now carrying the full authority of parental disappointment. Stocks, real estate ventures, business opportunities. Jessica listed desperately. But the market crashed, and the real estate deals fell through, and the business partners turned out to be fraudulent. Uncle Tom sat back in his chair with an expression of stunned disbelief. Jessica, you gambled with your sister's inheritance without her knowledge or consent? I thought I could make it work, she cried. I thought I could give her back more than she would have had originally. My mother was staring at Jessica as if seeing a stranger. All this time, we thought Kate was being unreasonable about family support. We thought she was holding grudges over minor financial disagreements. But you actually stole her inheritance? The word stole hit Jessica like a physical blow. She flinched as if she'd been slapped, her tears flowing even more freely. "I never meant for it to turn out this way," she sobbed. "I genuinely thought I could replace the money before she came home. When the investments failed, I panicked. I didn't know how to explain what had happened." David was now standing slightly apart from Jessica, his expression reflecting the dawning realization that his new wife had committed actions that were not only morally questionable but potentially illegal. "So you let Kate believe she was starting from nothing," Emma said with growing anger. "You let her struggle to build a business from scratch while you planned this elaborate wedding with money that should have been shared with her." "That's not fair," Jessica protested weakly. "I didn't know she would be so successful. I thought she would stay in the military or find a regular job. I never imagined she would need startup capital for a business." Her words revealed the fundamental disrespect that had underlain her decisions. She hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She'd done so while assuming I would never amount to anything significant enough to make the lost money matter. My father was shaking his head slowly, his face reflecting deep disappointment. "Jessica, how could you do this to your sister? How could you let her family believe she was being difficult when you knew the truth?" "I was ashamed," Jessica admitted through her tears. "Every year that passed made it harder to tell the truth. I kept hoping I would find a way to make it right." "By marrying into money?" Aunt Susan asked with obvious disgust. Jessica's tears intensified at the accusation, but she didn't deny it. The implication was clear. Her relationship with David might have been motivated, at least in part, by the financial security his family could provide, security she needed because she'd squandered her own inheritance. I had remained silent throughout this entire exchange, watching my family grapple with revelations that transformed their understanding of both Jessica and me. Part of me felt vindicated to finally have the truth acknowledged, but another part felt genuinely sorry for the pain this was causing everyone involved. "Kate," my mother said quietly, turning toward me with tears in her own eyes, "we owe you more than an apology. We owe you justice." "And an explanation," my father added. "We should have investigated more thoroughly when you tried to tell us what happened. We failed you as parents by choosing the easier story over the truth." Their acknowledgement meant more to me than I'd expected. For 6 years I'd carried the double burden of financial loss and family rejection, believing that my own relatives had found Jessica's version of events more palatable than my accusations. Now they were finally understanding the scope of the betrayal and their own role in perpetuating it. David had been quietly observing this family drama unfold, but now he stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "I think there's something else everyone should know," he said carefully. "Something Jessica told me during our conversation." Jessica looked at him with panic in her eyes, clearly desperate to prevent additional revelations. "David, please," she whispered. "Not here, not now." But David's expression suggested he'd made a decision about honesty that couldn't be reversed. "My family has been discussing potential business partnerships with Kate's company. They've been researching Williams' development group for several months." The admission added another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. Not only had Jessica known about my business success, but she'd been actively involved in discussions about potential collaborations between our companies. "Jessica knew about Kate's success because my parents have been trying to arrange meetings with her," David continued. "They see Williams' development group as exactly the kind of innovative partner they want for their expansion projects." Emma looked between David and Jessica with growing incredulity. "So you've known for months that Kate is a millionaire business owner, and you never told your own family?" "I was planning to tell everyone after the wedding," Jessica said desperately. "I wanted this day to be perfect before we dealt with complicated family issues." "Complicated family issues?" Uncle Tom repeated with obvious anger. "Jessica, you stole your sister's inheritance and then hid her success from her own family while trying to profit from business connections with her company?" The full scope of Jessica's deception was now laid bare before our entire family. She hadn't just betrayed me 6 years ago. She'd been actively managing information and relationships to maximize her own benefit while keeping me isolated from family support. My mother was crying now, her earlier pride in Jessica's wedding completely replaced by shame and regret. "Kate, how can we ever make this right?" How can we earn your forgiveness for believing lies and abandoning you when you needed us most? Before I could respond, Margaret Davidson appeared at our table with an expression of concern that suggested she'd noticed the emotional distress of the bridal party. Is everything all right? She asked diplomatically. David, your father was looking for you to discuss tomorrow's golf arrangements. David glanced around our table, clearly recognizing that this wasn't a situation that could be quickly resolved or easily explained to his family. We're just having some family discussions, he said carefully. I'll find Dad in a few minutes. Margaret's gaze moved between Jessica's tear-stained face and the obvious tension radiating from our group. As an experienced hostess and businesswoman, she undoubtedly recognized the signs of serious family conflict. Perhaps there's a quieter place where you could continue your conversation, she suggested tactfully. The library in the main house is available if you need privacy. Her offer was diplomatically phrased but clearly motivated by concern that our family drama might disrupt her son's wedding reception. Other guests were beginning to notice the distress at our table, and the last thing anyone wanted was for Jessica's perfect day to be publicly ruined by revelations about inheritance theft and family betrayal. That might be best. My father agreed, recognizing that we needed to move this conversation away from the reception before it became even more disruptive. As our family began gathering themselves to relocate, I found myself looking at Jessica with a mixture of pity and residual anger. 6 years ago, her betrayal had nearly destroyed me financially and emotionally. Tonight, the truth was finally destroying the false narrative she'd constructed to protect herself. But as we prepared to continue our confrontation in private, I realized that the evening had already accomplished something I hadn't expected. My family finally understood not just what Jessica had done to me, but what I had accomplished despite her actions. The transformation was complete, from misunderstood family disappointment to recognized success story, and no amount of tears or explanations could undo that revelation. The real question now was what would happen next, both for my relationship with Jessica and for my connection to a family that was finally ready to acknowledge they'd been wrong about everything. The library in the Davidson Estate's main house was exactly what I expected from a family of their caliber: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books reaching toward a coffered ceiling, and the kind of furniture that spoke of generations of wealth and refinement. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of distinguished ancestors watched over the room with silent authority. It was a space designed for serious conversations and important decisions, which made it perfectly suited for the confrontation that was about to unfold. My family filed into the room with the subdued energy of people preparing for an execution. Jessica sat heavily in a wingback chair near the fireplace, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream, while David remained standing beside her with the posture of someone ready to flee at the first opportunity. My parents took seats on the leather sofa, their expressions reflecting the emotional exhaustion of parents who had discovered their understanding of their children was fundamentally flawed. Emma claimed a chair near the window, her phone still clutched in her hand like a weapon loaded with additional revelations. Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan positioned themselves near the door, perhaps unconsciously seeking escape routes from the family crisis they'd stumbled into. I chose to remain standing near the massive mahogany desk that dominated one wall, the physical elevation giving me a psychological advantage as I prepared to finally speak my truth after 6 years of enforced silence. Margaret Davidson had graciously provided coffee and water before discreetly closing the library doors, ensuring our privacy while probably hoping we could resolve our family drama without further disrupting her son's wedding celebration. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this confrontation in a room that represented exactly the kind of generational wealth and family legacy that Jessica had stolen from both of us. "All right," my father said heavily, settling back against the sofa cushions. "No more partial truths or careful explanations. Jessica, I want you to tell us exactly what happened, from the beginning." Jessica looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her perfect wedding makeup now streaked with tears and mascara. The transformation from radiant bride to devastated confessor was so complete that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I signed the power of attorney papers 3 days before Kate deployed," Jessica began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just like hundreds of other military families do. It was supposed to be for emergencies, for situations where immediate decisions were needed while she was overseas." My mother leaned forward, her expression encouraging Jessica to continue despite the obvious pain this conversation was causing. The first few months were fine, Jessica continued. I paid the property taxes, handled some minor maintenance issues, everything Kate and I had discussed before she left. But then I started getting calls from real estate developers who wanted to make offers on the ranch. Uncle Tom shifted in his chair, his construction industry experience giving him insight into property development tactics. What kind of offers? Substantial ones, Jessica admitted. The area was becoming popular for weekend estates and luxury developments. People were offering 3 times what we thought the property was worth. Emma looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been continuing her research into our family's business affairs. How much was the ranch worth? Jessica hesitated, clearly reluctant to reveal numbers that would make her subsequent actions seem even more egregious. The offers started at $600,000 and went up to $850,000. The silence that followed her admission was profound. $850,000. Even split between 2 sisters, that represented life-changing money. The kind of inheritance that could fund education, business ventures, or provide security for decades. The magnitude of what she'd stolen from me was finally being quantified for our family. And you decided to sell without consulting Kate, my father said, his voice flat with disappointment. I tried to contact her, Jessica protested weakly, but communications were limited because of her deployment location. The developers were pressuring me to make quick decisions, saying the offers might not be available if we waited. Aunt Susan made a disgusted sound. Jessica, military families deal with communication challenges all the time. There are procedures for reaching deployed personnel about important matters. I know that now, Jessica said, fresh tears starting to flow. But I was 24 years old and overwhelmed by the pressure and the money being offered. I convinced myself I was protecting our interests by accepting the highest offer. David finally spoke, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose wedding day had been completely derailed by family revelations. Jessica, tell them what you told me about the investment decisions. Jessica shot him a look that mixed betrayal with desperation, clearly hoping he would help protect her from the full consequences of her confessions. But David's expression remained resolute, suggesting he'd made his own decision about honesty and accountability. I didn't just put the money in a savings account, Jessica continued reluctantly. I thought I was being smart by investing it to make it grow before Kate came home. What kind of investments? Emma asked with the persistence of someone who sensed there were deeper layers to this story. A friend from college had started a real estate flipping business, Jessica explained. He promised incredible returns, sometimes 50 or 60% profit in just a few months. I thought I could double Kate's inheritance before she returned. Uncle Tom groaned audibly, recognizing the classic signs of investment fraud that had destroyed countless family fortunes. Jessica, please tell me you didn't give hundreds of thousands of dollars to some college friend with promises of unrealistic returns. He had documentation, Jessica said defensively. Business plans, profit projections, examples of previous successful projects. It all looked legitimate. My mother was shaking her head slowly, her expression reflecting the horror of a parent watching their child describe making catastrophically bad decisions. How much money did you lose to this investment scheme? Not all of it, Jessica said quickly. I only invested half initially, keeping the rest as security. But when the first investment seemed to be paying off, when he showed me documents proving the profits, I invested the remaining money to maximize our returns. Emma was typing rapidly on her phone again, probably researching the timeline of Jessica's story to verify details against public records. What happened when Kate tried to contact you about visiting the ranch after her deployment? Jessica's face crumpled at the memory. That's when everything fell apart. The investment company disappeared overnight. My friend stopped returning calls. The addresses they'd given me turned out to be fake. I realized I'd lost everything. Everything, my father repeated slowly. You lost your sister's entire inheritance to investment fraud. I tried to fix it, Jessica said desperately. I took out loans, I sold my own possessions, I even borrowed money from friends. But I couldn't replace $800,000. When Kate called about visiting the ranch, I had to tell her something. So I said we'd had to sell it because of financial pressures. The room fell silent again, as everyone processed the complete scope of Jessica's deception. She hadn't just made a bad investment decision. She'd constructed an elaborate lie to cover up the loss of money that wasn't hers to risk. And when Kate confronted you about the sale, Aunt Susan said quietly, you made our entire family believe she was being unreasonable about family financial decisions. I panicked, Jessica sobbed. I knew if I told the truth, everyone would hate me. I thought maybe I could find other ways to replace the money over time, maybe through my career, or marriage, or other opportunities. Quote, David's expression darkened at the implication that their relationship might have been motivated by financial considerations. Jessica, are you saying you pursued our relationship because of my family's wealth? No, Jessica said quickly, but her denial lacked conviction. I mean, not entirely. I do love you, David. But I won't lie and say your family's financial stability wasn't attractive to someone carrying the burden of what I'd done. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning not just our family relationships but potentially Jessica's marriage before it was even a day old. David stepped away from her chair, his body language clearly indicating emotional distance. So let me understand this completely, I said, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the library. My voice was steady despite the emotions churning inside me. You stole my inheritance using legal documents meant for emergencies. You gambled it away on fraudulent investments. You lied to our entire family about what happened. You let me struggle to rebuild my life from nothing while you knew exactly why I had nothing. And then, when you discovered I had succeeded despite your betrayal, you hid that information from our family while trying to profit from business connections with my company. Jessica looked up at me with desperate eyes, seeking some sign of forgiveness or understanding that I wasn't prepared to offer. Kate, I know how it sounds, but I never meant for any of this to happen. I was young and scared and made terrible decisions, but I never stopped loving you or wanting to make things right. Wanting to make things right, I repeated, my voice rising slightly. Jessica, you had 6 years to make things right. 6 years to tell the truth, to acknowledge what you'd done, to seek help in replacing what you stole. Instead, you let me believe our family had abandoned me because I was being unreasonable about minor financial disagreements. My mother was crying now, her hands covering her face as she absorbed the full impact of how her family had been manipulated and divided by Jessica's lies. Kate, we failed you so completely. We should have investigated, should have demanded proof, should have trusted your character over Jessica's explanations. You believed what you wanted to believe, I said, not unkindly, but with absolute honesty. Jessica's story was easier to accept than the alternative. It's easier to think your daughter made reasonable financial decisions under pressure than to believe she committed theft and fraud against her own sister. Emma looked up from her phone with an expression of renewed shock. Kate, I found more information about your business timeline. According to these articles, you started your first property purchase just 8 months after returning from deployment. How did you go from having no money to qualifying for commercial property loans so quickly? Her question touched on the most painful period of my life, the months when I'd worked 3 different jobs while studying for real estate licensing exams and building the credit history and down payment needed for my first investment. It had been a grinding, exhausting period that had required every ounce of determination I possessed. I worked 80-hour weeks, I replied simply. 2 full-time jobs and weekend consulting work. I lived in a studio apartment that cost $400 a month and ate ramen noodles for dinner most nights. I saved every penny for 18 months to get the down payment for my first building. Uncle Tom was staring at me with something approaching awe. Kate, that level of discipline and determination is extraordinary. Most people couldn't sustain that kind of sacrifice. Most people haven't had their inheritance stolen and their family turn against them, I replied. Desperation is a powerful motivator. David had been silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with obvious reluctance. There's something else Jessica told me that everyone should know. Jessica's head snapped up, her expression panicked. David, please don't. She's been in contact with private investigators, David continued, ignoring her protests. For the past 2 years, she's been having your business activities monitored and reported to her. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only had Jessica stolen my inheritance and lied about it, but she'd been actively spying on my business success while keeping that information from our family. Why? Emma asked, her voice reflecting the horror we all felt. Because she was planning to ask Kate for money, David said quietly. She wanted to know exactly how much Kate was worth before approaching her about repaying the inheritance. Jessica was sobbing uncontrollably now, her careful wedding hairstyle completely ruined and her makeup streaked beyond repair. "I was going to tell you everything after the wedding," she gasped between sobs. "I was going to explain what happened and offer to pay you back from David's family business connections. Pay me back with other people's money," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Even your plan to make restitution involved using resources that weren't your own." My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger I'd rarely seen from him. "Jessica, what you've described isn't just financial mismanagement or poor judgment. It's systematic fraud, theft, and manipulation that has damaged this family for 6 years." "Dad, please," Jessica pleaded, but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, Jessica, you stole from your sister while she was serving our country. You lied to your parents about the circumstances. You manipulated our entire family into believing Kate was the problem. And then you compounded those crimes by spying on her success, while planning to ask for money you had no right to request." Aunt Susan was shaking her head in disgust. "Jessica, I keep thinking about all the family gatherings where we felt sorry for you for having such a difficult sister. All the times we criticized Kate for not being more supportive of family. You orchestrated all of that deception." "I never asked anyone to criticize Kate," Jessica protested weakly. "You didn't have to ask," Emma said with obvious anger. "You just had to maintain your victim narrative while providing no context for Kate's behavior. You made her look like the villain in her own tragedy." The truth of Emma's observation seemed to hit Jessica with particular force. She'd not only stolen my money and lied about it, but she'd successfully positioned herself as the sympathetic figure while I was cast as the ungrateful sister who couldn't let go of minor family conflicts. Margaret Davidson appeared at the library door with a soft knock, her expression diplomatically neutral despite the obvious distress emanating from our family group. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said carefully, "but some of the wedding guests are beginning to ask about Jessica and David's availability for traditional reception activities." David looked between his new wife, who was still sobbing in her ruined wedding dress, and his mother, who was clearly concerned about salvaging what remained of the evening's celebration. "Mom, we need a few more minutes," David said quietly. "There are some family matters that require immediate attention." Margaret's experienced eye took in Jessica's destroyed appearance and the obvious tension radiating from everyone in the room. "Of course. I'll have the DJ extend the dancing portion of the evening and delay the bouquet toss." After she closed the door again, leaving us alone with our family crisis, I found myself looking around the room at faces that reflected shame, anger, disappointment, and regret. 6 years of fractured relationships and misunderstood motivations had been laid bare in the space of 2 hours. "What happens now?" my mother asked quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. Before anyone could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Rachel in Austin. I glanced at the screen and saw her name, probably calling to check on how I was surviving the family wedding drama. "Excuse me," I said, stepping toward the window to take the call. "Rachel, this isn't a great time." "Kate, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's something urgent you need to know." Rachel's voice was tense with excitement. "The Henderson Group just called. They want to move forward with the downtown development project we've been discussing. They're offering a partnership deal worth $40 million, but they need an answer by Monday morning." The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more ironic. While my family was grappling with the revelation of my existing business success, an opportunity had just emerged that would double my company's value overnight. "40 million?" I repeated, loud enough for everyone in the library to hear. "Plus a guaranteed contract for the next 3 phases of their expansion plan," Rachel continued. "Kate, this could make you one of the largest commercial developers in Texas. Are you interested in moving forward?" I looked around the library at my family's shocked faces as they processed this new information. Jessica had stopped crying and was staring at me with an expression of complete devastation, finally understanding the true magnitude of what she'd stolen from herself as much as from me. "Yes," I said into the phone. "Schedule the meeting for Monday morning. I'll be back in Austin tomorrow evening." After ending the call, I turned back to face my family, all of whom were staring at me with renewed awe and confusion. $40 million? Emma whispered. "A development partnership," I confirmed. "My company has been selected for a major downtown Austin project." David was looking at me with obvious respect, and perhaps a hint of regret about the business connections his family might have lost through Jessica's deception. "Kate, that's incredible. Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, then turned to address Jessica directly. "This is what you stole from me, Jessica. Not just the $800,000 from our grandparents' ranch, but the security and family support that could have made my early business years less desperate and more strategic. You didn't just take my money. You took my safety net when I was taking the biggest risks of my life." Jessica looked up at me with eyes that seemed to finally understand the complete scope of her betrayal's consequences. "Kate, what can I do? How can I possibly make this right?" The question hung in the air as everyone waited for my response. After 6 years of carrying the weight of betrayal and rebuilding everything from nothing, I finally had the power to determine what justice looked like for my family. I looked at Jessica sitting in that leather chair, her wedding dress wrinkled and tear-stained, and realized that the person who had hurt me most deeply was also the most broken person in the room. The anger I'd carried for 6 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of justice and compassion that surprised even me. "Jessica," I said quietly, "you can't make this right. You can't give me back 6 years of family support or the security I should have had while building my business. You can't undo the lies or restore the trust you destroyed." Her face crumpled at my words, but I wasn't finished. "However," I continued, "you can start telling the truth. To David, to his family, to anyone else you've misled. You can stop living in deception and start building something honest." David stepped closer to Jessica's chair, his expression unreadable. "What does that mean for us? For our marriage?" Jessica looked up at him with desperate hope. "David, I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the person you thought you were marrying." "The person I thought I was marrying didn't exist," David replied sadly. "But maybe the person you could become does. That's something we'll have to figure out together, probably with professional help." My mother wiped her eyes and stood up, walking over to where I stood by the window. "Kate, can you ever forgive us? Can you forgive me for not believing you when you needed me most?" I took her hands, feeling how cold and trembling they were. "Mom, I've already forgiven you. I forgave you years ago because I had to, for my own peace of mind. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were." "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means we start over," I said. "We build new relationships based on who we actually are now, not who we were 6 years ago. You're going to visit me in Austin this summer, and you're going to see the life I've built. Really see it, not just hear about it secondhand." My father joined us, his face showing more emotion than I'd seen from him in years. "Kate, I'm proud of you. I should have said that long ago, but I'm saying it now. You took the worst thing that could happen to you and turned it into extraordinary success." "Thank you, Dad. That means more than you know." Emma had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from her phone one final time. "Kate, I found something else. There's a scholarship program in your name at the University of Texas for military veterans pursuing business degrees. You've been funding it for 2 years." The room fell silent again as everyone processed this new information about my character and priorities. "How much?" Uncle Tom asked quietly. $50,000 annually, Emma read. "It says here you wanted to help other veterans avoid the financial struggles you experienced when transitioning to civilian careers." Jessica's sobs intensified as she realized that while she'd been hoarding secrets and planning deceptions, I'd been quietly helping people who faced similar challenges to what she'd created for me. "Jessica," I said, addressing her directly, I want you to do something for me. She looked up with tear-streaked hope. I want you to volunteer with veteran support organizations. I want you to spend time with people who are struggling to rebuild their lives after serving our country. I want you to understand what you put me through by seeing it in other people's experiences. I will, she whispered. I promise I will. David nodded approvingly. We'll do it together. It might help us both understand the impact of the choices we make. Margaret Davidson appeared at the door again, this time with obvious urgency. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the photographer needs Jessica and David for some final shots before the evening ends. Jessica looked down at her ruined appearance and laughed bitterly. I'm not exactly photo ready. We have a makeup artist standing by, Margaret said diplomatically. She can work miracles. As Jessica prepared to leave for damage control, she paused beside my chair. Kate, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but will you stay in touch? Will you give me a chance to prove I can change? I considered her request carefully. I'll stay in touch with our family. Whether that includes you depends on whether you follow through on the commitments you've made tonight. She nodded, understanding that trust would have to be earned rather than granted. After Jessica and David left to salvage the final moments of their wedding reception, my family and I sat in the quiet library, processing everything that had transpired. What happens to your business partnership with David's family? Aunt Susan asked. That depends on them, I replied. I won't hold Jessica's actions against David if he's committed to building something honest. Business is business, and personal is personal. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. How did it go? Are you surviving the family drama? I typed back. Better than expected. Family secrets exposed. Truths revealed. Healing has begun. See you Monday for the Henderson meeting. 3 months later, I stood in my Austin office, looking out at the city skyline, reflecting on how much had changed since that night in the Davidson Estate Library. The Henderson project was proceeding ahead of schedule. My scholarship program had expanded to include 3 Texas universities. And my relationship with my family had slowly begun to rebuild on a foundation of honesty rather than assumptions. Jessica had indeed started volunteering with veteran organizations, and her weekly emails to me were filled with stories of people she was helping and insights she was gaining about resilience and recovery. David had joined her in this work, and their marriage appeared to be surviving the crisis through transparency and mutual commitment to growth. My parents had visited Austin as promised, spending a weekend touring my properties and meeting my business partners. My mother had wept when she saw my penthouse, not from the luxury but from understanding how far I'd traveled from the broken young woman who had returned from deployment to find her inheritance stolen and her family unsupportive. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Margaret Davidson. Kate, I wanted to thank you, she said, for how you handled that difficult situation at the wedding. You could have destroyed Jessica publicly, but you chose a path that allowed healing for everyone. Revenge would have been easy, I replied. Justice required more thought. Well, your approach seems to be working. Jessica and David are stronger than ever, and they're doing meaningful work helping veterans. You gave them a chance to become better people. After ending the call, I smiled and returned to reviewing contracts for my next development project. The woman who had attended her sister's wedding 6 months ago had been successful but isolated, carrying years of anger and family estrangement. The woman I was today was still successful but now surrounded by relationships built on truth and mutual respect. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying those who hurt you, but helping them become people worthy of forgiveness. And sometimes, the best inheritance isn't money at all, but the strength to build something better from the ashes of betrayal. My family had finally learned who I really was, and I had learned that being right matters less than being whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.